Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. When you learn the very basics of chess, you're being taught that it's very important to always ask yourself the question, what does my opponent want to do? At a beginner level, those questions would be, is any of my pieces under attack? Does my opponent want to capture my queen, my rook, my bishop, and so on? Or it could be, does my opponent want to checkmate me on the next move? Well, when you're beyond that basic level, that your pieces are kind of flying around, the next step will be some more subtle threats. Like, for example, threatening to trade queens in a way that you'll be forced to recapture with a pawn, which will end up two of your pawns on the same file. Or it could be tactical threats, but a bit more complex. So we'll see some examples in this lesson in a game that was played by two casual players, that when it's important to pay attention to the threats, and other times when you can simply prepare for them and be ready to meet them with the right answer. The game started out with b3, which is a somewhat unusual or rare opening, although it's certainly a playable one, and in fact the late Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen used to like to play it in one time, and in fact the opening is generally called as the Larsen opening, after him. The difference between black's choice of setup is that black is focusing on the center right from the very beginning, while white is trying to attack the center from the side. As you can see, white moved the bishop to the long diagonal and immediately targeting central squares d4 and e5, in fact attacking black's pawn on e5. Therefore, black now combines development with the protection of the pawn with knight c6. And in this game, white played g3, which is called fianchettoing the bishop. So after the next move, both white bishops will be so-called fianchettoed. Black continues the development, occupying the center, and white plays bishop g2, and black plays knight f6. You can see a very clear contrast between the two game plans, where black plays the traditional way, developing the knights first, occupying the center with pawns, while white is playing a more modern approach, allowing the other side to occupy the center and then try to attack it from the side. This particular setup and exact situation, I certainly would prefer the black side. Not that black is that much better, but I would say black is certainly more comfortable, having more space and a better control and presence in the center. White responded with d3, normal move, and black developed his bishop to c5. Now, in this position is the first moment where white is afraid of the shadows. It's true that in situations similar to this, when a bishop is on c5 and is aiming towards the pawn on f2, sometimes indeed you have to be careful about the threats of a knight coming to g4 and attacking in a collaboration between the bishop and the knight the f2 pawn. Very true, indeed, you have to be careful of that. However, the general typical way to prepare for it is to simply ignore it, continue with your development that you're supposed to do anyway, getting ready to castle, and indeed, when and if the black knight comes to g4, white is ready to castle and then accomplishing his normal development plans, getting the rook on the other side of the king, protecting the f2 pawn a second time. If now black continues and still captures it, white will be glad to go for this trade, and typically this trade in the opening, when white gives up a rook and pawn versus the opponent's bishop and knight, it favors the side that is giving up the rook and pawn, in this case white. You may wonder why, since rook and pawn are 6 points and bishop plus knight are also 6 points. The reason is, on one hand, that in the middle game the bishop and knight are more usable than a rook that is hidden behind so many pawns. The other element is, in this case, that black has wasted 5 moves, 2 with the bishop and 3 with the knight, to accomplish this exchange, while all white did was castled and then captured back on f2. So in other words, black lost 3 moves to accomplish an exchange. If you may wonder, but how about the white king? It's no longer in its safety zone on the king side. That's true, but that is only a temporary problem that white faces. The white king is able to very quickly go back to g1 and if needed even to h1 to safely hide against potential dangers. But for now, those dangers are not even quite there. Let's go back to the actual game, where after bishop c5, white continued with h3. This is the move I was referring to that is not necessary. In a way, it's a waste of time, and more so even, it somewhat weakens the future defense in front of the white king. We assume that the white king will castle to the king's side, so therefore this is certainly not a necessary move. Now, on the other hand, what should black do? Black should simply castle. There is no reason to delay that natural and needed move any further. Black's move was kind of a little strange, moving the same piece a second time, and there is certainly no need for it whatsoever. The bishop doesn't stand any better on b6 than it was on c5. Moreover, in some cases, it will invite the white bishop to come to a3, which would in this case prevent black from castling, although it wouldn't be a deadly threat in this case because black would now play knight e7 and then could castle anyway. But nevertheless, this bishop move is just kind of a waste of time, and castling right away would be better. White now developed and at the same time attacked the pawn on e5. So here the question is, what should black do about it? Black could obviously protect the pawn, push the pawn, or block the attack towards the pawn. The best way to react here is to simply protect the pawn and, for example, play queen e7. You may wonder, but that's all nice and great, but didn't we say not to move the queen early in the game? True, I did say that. However, when it's A, to avoid losing material, it's certainly an exception, and B, moving the queen just one little square up in one of the center files, not blocking either of the bishops, because the dark squared bishop is already out, it generally is a good idea, because sooner or later, once black castles and develops the other bishop as well, we would want to make that queen move anyway, in order not to have any pieces in between the two rooks. So the two rooks will get connected. The other move, advancing the attacked pawn, wouldn't be a top choice in this case, because white would simply capture that, and then if pawn takes, white would trade queens, and white wouldn't have any problems whatsoever. Black played d4, blocking the threat of the bishop towards the e5 pawn, but this is not the best choice because it locks in the bishop on b6 on one hand and strengthens the power of white's bishop on the other diagonal. And thirdly, it also opens up the c4 square, which can be a very nice outpost for one of the white knights in the near future. So after d4, if I were white, I would surely just castle and move on with the game. White instead immediately played c3, which is not the greatest idea, because after the exchange of these pawns, even if black trades now on c3, the bishop on b6 will be revived. And also, as you shall see, if black ignores it, as they did in the game, and castle, the trade on c4 is not helping white at all. The contrary, in fact, if now black would take back with the e-pawn, it would be black who achieves something, namely the opening of the e-file, and then after the rook would get to the e-file, as well as the queen, black would seriously pressure white's pawn on e2. However, black in the game chose not to recapture with the pawn, which was the better of the recaptures, but took back with the knight, which is of course also playable. On one hand, it did not open the e-file, and on the other hand, also it leaves the e5 pawn hanging, although it'd be rather dangerous for white to capture that pawn, because then black would follow up with rook e8, immediately attacking the knight, and if that knight now moves away, then black would be free to capture the pawn on e2 with the rook or the knight. If after knight takes pawn, rook attacks the knight, which is a very typical reaction in similar situations, white could also protect the knight, which is the better option, but black would get an excellent position here, as the white king will have serious problem castling in the near future. For example, black could continue with knight h5, which immediately targets white's pawn on g3, which seems real hard to defend. If the king castles or moves into this diagonal by king f2 protecting the pawn on g3, that's pretty suicidal, because the other black knight all of a sudden can jump freely, for example even to c2, giving a discover check, as well as attacking the rook, or number of other jumps like knight b3, same idea, discover check and attacking the rook, or even moving knight to f5 and attacking the g3 pawn a second time. So black has plenty of excellent jumps. So therefore, grabbing the pawn on e5 in this position is suicidal for white, and white better doesn't do that. White, on the other hand, could castle in this position, but that has its own drawbacks. If white castles, then black will be ready to trade knights, using the momentum that if now the bishop captures, then white loses a pawn, or if white captures with the pawn, that obviously has a very bad view in isolating the pawn on d3, as well as doubling up the two white f-pawns and locking up the bishop on g2. So a lot of trouble with that. What white could do is play knight d2. That's a reasonable choice. So now, after the knights would be traded on f3, white would get the opportunity to capture back with a knight. But the actual game continued with knight takes knight, and here again black has the option to take back with the pawn, which would be my number one choice here, again with the idea to then play rook e8 and create pressure on the e-file. And even though here again the b6 bishop is kind of locked up, it has a potential of going to a5, and once the e-file is open, that can become an important factor. Because let's suppose white castles and black plays rook e8, starts putting pressure on the pawn on e2, and if white plays the natural rook e1 move, then already the bishop can have an important role in playing bishop a5 and creating a little commotion for the rook on e1. But let's proceed where black played bishop takes instead of pawn takes, and white protected the attacked bishop with the queen on c2. And this is the next momentum when black felt that he wants to get his c pawn out of danger's way, even though that pawn is well protected at the moment. He felt that he wants to free up the queen just in case it needs to move. Well, on one hand there is something to that. At the same time, the question is how to do it. Black continued with c5, making sure that now the queen no longer needs to stay on d8 and protect the pawn. However, a much better way to accomplish the same would be to move the pawn up one square to c6. The point is that now the pawn on c6 holds off the power of white's bishop on g2 as well, not just freeing up the queen. So let's move on, where black played c5 and white finally castled. Black played rook e8, it's a normal move, and white played knight d2. Knight c3 may be a bit better development move. Generally, when you have the opportunity to develop a piece that controls two central squares, it's the better choice. And now black finally developed the last minor piece that was undeveloped until this point, and we're reaching the middle game part of the game. Generally, in that part of the game becomes a bit more concrete, more tactical, and it's also the time of serious decisions. Right now, white has the opportunity to capture the pawn on b7, although white's material advantage would be short-lived, as black can capture the pawn on h3 also, and then after bishop takes rook in the corner, now not capturing white's rook right away, but first capture the bishop. Pretty nice move, threatening with checkmate immediately, and only when white defends against that threat, then capturing the rook, and the position would have even material and close to equal position. So certainly this would have been a good choice for white, capturing on b7. White's choice not only that missed out on this opportunity, but worsened things for white by playing e3 right here. And this is another typical mistake that inexperienced players make, in that they look out for the opponent's threats, but yet don't consider the changes in a position when they plan their own moves. Like in this case, black wasn't threatening anything in particular. The pawn on d3 was nicely protected until the pawn was on e2. However, now that white just moved the pawn up from e2 to e3, that's the cause of all the troubles, in that now after the bishop trade on b2, the queen takes back and the pawn on d3 falls. So black won a pawn. Seemingly, white can win the pawn back, in fact in two different ways, but reality is that neither one really saves the day. If the queen takes the pawn, the problem is the same, that again there was no threat to the knight on d2, but because of white's last move, the queen moving away, now the queen indeed can capture white's knight and black wins a piece. The other pawn capture is a bit better, although still doesn't win the pawn back, because bishop takes h3 and now both rooks are hanging, so if bishop takes, the black bishop takes, and let's say white takes and the rook takes. And of course, important to point out that queen e5 does not win the pawn back again because of the knight hanging on d2. The game continued here with rook to d1. And this is yet another critical position in this game where black needs to make a decision. An experienced eye can immediately tell that after a white rook move to d1, white creates some potential discovery jumps with the knight. Indeed, the knight threatens to jump to e4, for example, or c4, with some unpleasant threats for black. However, it's important to remember that you don't necessarily have to go right away on the defense as black did in this game. Sometimes you can indeed follow up with your own attack or own plans while at the same time readying yourself for the opponent's threat. In this case, that move would have been playing rook to d8, getting ready that if and when the white knight jumps, then to give up the queen for the two rooks, which generally is a pretty good trade for the side who gets the two rooks. The other option is to retreat with the queen, of course. Get out of that potential problem, and that's certainly understandable. To be quite honest, my first choice would be to play queen a6, retreat, and protect that pawn. Black in the game, on the other hand, played queen g6, which is certainly not a bad idea if you have ambitious ideas afterwards on the king side. But if your idea is just to retreat the queen somewhere out of danger's way, this is certainly not the direction to go. White continued with bishop takes pawn, and here the most natural response would be to play rook b8, very typical. When the opponent captures a pawn like that, attacking your rook, move the rook away with a tempo attacking the bishop. Now, if the bishop returns, black could play c4 immediately, taking advantage of the existing pin along the b file. Black wasted time by moving the rook to d8 instead, without any immediate attack. White retreated the bishop to g2. In this position, to make sense of black's last two moves, black should have continued ambitiously by playing queen h5, trying to attack on the king's side. Now, either white would need to weaken himself by pushing one of the pawns forward, or needing to step into a pin by playing king h2, which would be welcomed for black. Then, black could continue, for example, with e4, with ideas to then relocate the knight from g4 to e5, and then sometimes to d3 or e3. That could be one game plan, or in some cases to get the rook through d5 to g5 into the attack. In the game after bishop g2, black continued with rook b8. We can tell that that's a clear loss of time in not going there the move earlier instead of rook d8. In this position, black has a number of weaknesses. The isolated pawns on a7 and c5, and white should target them. The pawn on e5 was pretty safe because of yet another discovery. Black could grab the pawn on b3 and attack white's queen at the same go as well as the rook. The correct ways to play were either to play queen a3, which immediately targets the two weaknesses that black has, or by playing rook to c1, targeting the weakness on c5. White didn't choose either, but played knight f3, which is an clearly inferior move. Now, black should continue by playing e4, chasing the knight away, and more importantly, making sure the pawn on e5 is not hanging anymore. Instead, black made a blunder by playing bishop d5, allowing a discovery. As you can see, there was a number of discovery themes in this game. This time the knight attacks the queen while it opened up the diagonal of the bishop. So, for example, after the queen moves away, bishop takes bishop, and black lost a piece. Always be very careful in putting your pieces in a potential discovery. Well, I hope you learned some from this game. Make sure you're not afraid of shadows. Oftentimes, you don't even need to defend against an attack, but you can proceed with your own attack and getting ready for that potential threat. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye until next time.